A note for David and Rick, if there's any chance that you can get some sort of copy of all of this to either in a edited form or a non-edited form to the four Willhelm children, Stephanie, Jeffrey, Tom, and Eric, as well as for Barbara Shaw and maybe my sister Lenore and my brother Leland, I would appreciate that. George was an exaggerator. He knew how to say the right things to people all the time. He could sell anything to anybody. He could sell any idea to anybody way better than anybody I think I've ever been around. He truly had a way with words, and I doubt seriously if I'll ever run into somebody that had that much effect on people. We, back in the East Mecklenburg days, there was this wonderful group of people that ran together. That was, like I said, there's bits and pieces of Richard Nagel and Steve Province and David Fair and John and Linwood Sawyer and Jack Medica and the two Rigsby brothers, Ray and David, and a lot of different people that had crazy nighttime adventures, all night adventures. A lot of those times when we snuck the car out of George's house, we stayed up all night going from one place to the next. I don't know what stimulated us to stay up that late, but there was plenty of fun and plenty of action. One time George picked up a guy that, I guess a homeless guy, and just drove him around one night. Didn't know his name or anything. He was just sitting in the car riding with us. We all used to stop at other people's houses and just like a lot of people, spent a lot of time smoking weed, enjoying ourselves, experimenting with what was available back then. George had a way with women too. He had them coming and going, metaphorically speaking, and literally too. And I don't care who the girl was. If I was with her, or if John was with her, or if anybody was with her, George would say something that would get those girls' attention. And this is not like, this guy wasn't Mr. Butch or Mr. Tough guy. He was just knew all the right things to say to women. And they were all pretty. Even though he was playing jazz a lot, he could lure women into jazz clubs. Now that in itself is amazing. He had very good taste in women, and they all loved him, and they all thought he was true to them. And he was, you know, he loved them all. He really did. John, on the other hand, was much more conservative about women, but he was with them. But he picked and chose wisely, didn't let it bog him down at all. And they all loved him too. We had a wonderful time bonding by driving around on the weekends and going to places like, we'd take a bag of reefer and go up to the Blue Ridge Parkway and spend a whole Sunday going 35 miles an hour, stopping the car, getting out and looking, and come back home that night and just have truly great adventures. One of our favorite things to do was to climb Crowder's Mountain outside of Charlotte. George was just as good a climber, John was. We all ran. We all had such a good time. And these were the kind of things that I personally looked forward to a lot, especially at the time when I wasn't making so much music with them. But they were really happy moments running around cliff sides and hills and trees. Really felt good about that. Getting back to George and his musical ability, besides being able to play every instrument, he was truly a gifted jazz guitar player, and he worked so hard to get a Barney Kessel guitar. I think Gibson Barney Kessel, or maybe Fender, I forget. I'm not a guitar player. And big hollow body electric. I think Andre owns it now. Andre Ferrari also fits into all of this. Andre Ferrari was a great guitar player who learned a lot from George. George could, when I watched him play guitar, he could do the most amazing things, and a lot of times, and he did all this left-handed. Now you got to remember, he just flipped it over. He didn't do like Jimi Hendrix, who changed the strings. He actually just flipped it over and played it the other way. But I could watch him play, and a lot of times he would do the simplest things with 3 fingers, just playing just 3-string chords, and in the most amazing ways. He listened to all the jazz. He turned me on to jazz completely. Before that, I think the only jazz I was aware of was stuff like Dave Brubeck and the stuff that was kind of middle-of-the-road jazz. But after George, there was Miles Davis, you know, there was Joe Farrell, there was Chick Corea, and all the great players that he had so many different kinds of albums and styles. And we all listened to fusion rock and fusion jazz, but he didn't care for it as much. He knew how to play it. He knew how to play it all. John, on the other hand, really enjoyed playing that kind of stuff. George was more soulful, but really could cop anybody's style long enough to make you believe that he was capable of playing that style on a regular basis. And then he would do something funny, because he knew how to have a great sense of humor in his guitar playing. And you could make him do stuff on demand. He would literally just, you could tell him to throw something into a song, and he would be able to do it. And he would do it very quickly. And we all, through connections that I had with Steve Rucker and Chris Tennant, joining a band with them, we made connections with a guy in Charlotte named Bill Hanna, who was kind of the jazz king in Charlotte. He was an entertainer, but he was also a wonderful teacher who's responsible for so much jazz education in Charlotte. Played with Woody Herman's big band, and he was just, besides him performing in nightclubs, which we used to go to before I knew how to tip, he ran the big band at Independence High School, and among other things. And he used to have this Sunday night jam at his house where all the young musicians, most of us barely college age, would go over to his house and we'd learn songs together. And he would sit me at the piano and try to teach me stuff, and George would try to teach me stuff. George just could learn everything. I wasn't as quick as those guys, but George could learn everything. And one of the things, and even though George always rubbed people in a strange way, mainly because he was so talented in his own right, he always stressed practice. Practice, practice, practice. There's no way to get good at any of this stuff without practicing. And even though he had this amazing amount of natural ability, he never stopped practicing. He truly had a lot of talents that scare me when I think about it. He could draw. His relationship with his mother kind of made him an artist in the same sense. And when you walked into George and John's apartment, it had the most beautiful array of things on the walls that were from his mother or from him. And, very little of the poster type stuff. It was all original stuff. And you felt like you were in a museum at his house, at their apartment. John, with his drum style, was able to not only learn the great jazz drummers, but he was willing to smooth out and play in top 40 music. And he was a very good person to just say, this is what I want you to do, John, and he would do it. And then you go, wow, that's better than I thought it was going to be. Where George would say, no, Carl, you don't really want to do it that way. You want to do it this way, which would piss me off, but George was right too. That's the problem. George was in groups that he got fired from, but it wasn't because he wasn't good. He just couldn't fit into the top 40 thing like the rest of us were willing to do. Played with a band in Greensboro that was so great. I think they're called the Villagers, I'm not really sure. And John was in Sugar Creek, George was in the Flares, and then they all came together to do their Moose Magic group, which had David Powell playing bass for a while, another great player who couldn't get along with George, but wasn't because of the music. George is that way. He makes you jealous. And then they had Chip Dabney, who was more like John, who would basically do exactly what George asked him to do, and he would embellish it and fix it up and make it really nice, but never in the way, never pushy, never making trouble. I miss Chip. He's in another part of the country. We love the wide open spaces. I keep going back to that because we'd get in John's little Datsun station wagon that John had put a cassette deck in back in the early 70s and nice speakers. This crummy little car that we all drove around in, smoked pot and listened to all the music. And he was a great audiophile as well. And I think that John's family was the place that we all kind of came back to. All the children, all John's brothers and sisters were much younger. Jeffrey was pretty much up there, but John's parents were so understanding, and as all of our parents were, but John's parents were very understanding when it came to the connection, knew what it was all about, and kind of understood George's Svengali approach to things. I think that one of the things that bothered me about George was that it really had to be his way, or he was going to browbeat you about why you weren't doing it correctly. People like Bill Hanna, the great teacher, loved George, but had his differences with him. And it wasn't because of the music. It was never because of the music. Everybody knew that George just had such a well-rounded approach to the music. He was so far beyond just one style of music. He got us into everything. He could play rock and jazz and fusion and everything else. And I'm not even sure what style of music he would have been totally comfortable with, because he could play every one of them well. We also had a big thing for comedy albums, lots and lots of comedy albums. And once again, everybody had a great, refined sense of humor. It just wasn't toilet humor. It was a lot of fun and a lot of intricate type of humor, Firesign Theater and Monty Python. John got me into Monty Python back when they used to have their little show on PBS, and we watched that religiously. And we took trips. We took trips besides the Blue Ridge Parkway, and I mentioned New Orleans. We took trips to Myrtle Beach. We took trips to New York City to see my sisters, Joan and Lenore. And Lenore and George and I had wonderful escapades running around Manhattan, going into jazz clubs. I remember one instance where we went into the 5 spot and we saw Sam Rivers, great saxophone player, and the entire night was nothing but this unstructured jazz that never stopped. They were just playing and jamming. There was never a melody in there, but they just kept playing. And I remember looking at the crowd and how we all looked real serious while we were listening to it, like it was something amazing. But after a while, it got pretty boring to me, and even to George. He knew that they were great players. But we went to a lot of clubs together and saw a lot of wonderful musicians, and anytime George had a chance to play for somebody, he impressed them. Whatever the situation was, if they got to hear him, and when he played in jazz clubs, he impressed girls a lot. And that is another reason to be jealous of George. Let me think here. He knew all of my family. He knew that we loved each other, and that we also had the same kind of relationships that every family has. And my family knew him. My family knew John. My mother had a good relationship with Mrs. Willhelm. I'm trying to think of what I might have left out here. I knew that they were on their way to having a wonderful career as producers, and I'm sorry, I'm back to where I don't remember what I want to talk about here.
Hired for flight.
Oh, that was back when George and I first met. I remember a situation involving Abby Norris, a girl that I went to junior high school with, that I was in love with, and when George saw her, he was in love with her, and so my job was to put them together. And they never really got together, but it was fun watching that whole adventure. It was the first thing that really kind of connected George and I together after our experience with Richard Nagel. The East Mecklenburg crowd was a wonderful group of people, and they were so different from my school, so I spent so much time around John, and then around George, and then henceforth John, and more time around John as those years went by. It was a very short period of time. We're talking here about a total of about maybe 7-8 years. I wish I could. I'm trying to zero in on certain events.
About the Smith prom.
That was the flight. That was hiring flight. That was all part of the prom that we did. I know that the people that got to be around George, like John Gelinas, the engineer down in Columbia, it really paid off for people when they started listening to George and let George run the operation. I mean, he just knew what he wanted, and John would fall in line as well as I would. Well, I didn't fall in line as well because I argue it a lot. One of the things that we did, besides our big love for buying obscure albums and every kind of album we could, was we all got synthesizers right at the beginning of the synthesizer age. John got an ARP 2600, one of those things that you do a lot of plugging in like a telephone operator would. George got an ARP Odyssey, and I got a Mini Moog, and we were all trying to compete with each other on that. But John, he was capable of building all these sounds. I mentioned that. He could write out the sounds. He could write out the direction of how the sound was developed. And he would give me a piece of paper that had a whole patch of how to build this sound, and it was So crazy. Whereas George, he used his art odyssey to wail, to take solos, instead of taking a solo on a guitar, he could take a solo on a synthesizer. And we weren't used to that. I, on the other hand, used the Mini Moog in rock and roll bands. One of the things that we all had to borrow money from our parents in order to get these instruments, which were not cheap. And I actually took out a loan. And an interesting thing happened after they had passed. I got this letter from Commercial Credit, and they said that my loan was paid off. And I said, I didn't pay it off. And I asked my parents, and they said they didn't pay it off. And I said, well, what the hell? I mean, I don't know what's going on here. So I was on my way to a job, lived in Charlotte. I was on my way to a job in Durham, North Carolina. And when I got there, this is way before cell phones, there was a message for me at the Ramada Inn that I was playing at that my father had called. And when I got on the phone with him, he told me the guy at Commercial Credit wouldn't tell him who paid it, said it was anonymous, but then he leaked the fact that whoever paid it had just lost a son. And I was freaked. I didn't know how to handle it. I mean, I went to see a friend of mine in Durham just to cry to him and tell him how bad I felt about this money, this paying off this thing. And I finally realized that it was John's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Willhelm. And when I went to see him a few months later and sat down with him, I told him that I kind of roundaboutly found out about it and didn't think I deserved it. And they said that once everything was settled, they wanted to do something nice with some of the money. My friend had told me, you know, if they think you're deserving of it, then you're deserving of it. But, you know, I didn't know. I just loved the Willhelms, and I'm sure I would have done the same thing. But it felt great and it felt bad all at the same time. And a heavy moment. I do know that one of the things I do remember about the funeral and the burial was how good people were to me about our relationship, and how many times they basically connected me to their lives. I know that, I'm sure one of the normal thoughts that I had when I was first heard about it was, why wasn't I with them when this happened? You know, we were that close. I don't think I'll ever have a male bonding relationship with anybody like that. I'm not sure if I'll have a artistic friendship with anybody like that again. There was a jazz. We did another concert. George had put together Just Jazz, and after they passed, I got together with Linwood Sawyer and Andre Ferreri, my friend, who I lived with as the days went by, and we put together another concert called Just Jazz for John and George. And I went to Central Piedmont Community College and got in touch with their fundraiser guy, and convinced we actually worked together to establish a fundraising for a recording studio at Central Piedmont in the name of John Willhelm and George Shaw. And because they spent a great deal of time at Central Piedmont, and So we did the same exact thing that we had done at the first concert, minus George and John, which obviously made a lot of difference. But so many musicians wanted to be part of it, and it was a beautiful experience. And I'm sorry, I don't think there was any video. The first one was all video, but the second one, there might not have been any video unless somebody's got some. Linwood, do you have any? Linwood Sawyer played a big part in George's life. I truly believe Linwood probably would have been around with George today. He was a great promoter, and he was a very intelligent guy that knew how to write, and it was a pleasure listening to that kind of human being. Knew him and his brother, John. But the amount of people that connected to George and John and I really showed their strength after they died, and they were good to me. They totally understood, and they didn't disrespect our relationship, and I love you all for that. I truly do. You Willhelm children, you aren't children anymore. I hope that you get a little bit more knowledge of how great John was. What a decent human being that I never had an argument with. George made up for all the arguments that I didn't have with John, because John was so understanding of everything. He was truly great. And Barbara Shaw, I love you, and I know that you were a photographer back then, and I knew that this wonderful connection between you and your mother and your brother and was great. I don't want to leave out Ted Shaw, Mr. Shaw, who was kind of stood there and watched it all, but was a wonderful father to George and a wonderful husband to Mary Todd, one of the coolest artists you ever saw. If you people get a chance, look up Mary Todd Shaw and look at some of her work, because it is special. She had a guy named Henry that she made up. It probably was some ancestor. And she would make a face with Henry's face on it, and she would put it on everything. She went around the world putting Henry's face on things to take photos of it. She would get people of all walks of life to hold this little picture of Henry up in front of them. She would make postage stamps with Henry's face on it, and truly a gifted person. And you can see where George got all of his creativity from. It amazed me. Back to George's musicianship. There was one period where George didn't have any work, and I was in a band, and we were doing stuff like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Jethro Tull. And our bass player quit. And George got wind of it, and he said, "Can I have a job?" And I said, "George, we got a guitar player." And he says, "No, I'll play bass." And I said, "You don't know the bass parts?" He goes, "I'll learn them." He had them all in a week. Everything. It sounded like he'd been in the band for years. I couldn't get over how quickly he learned the material. And then, when it was time for bass solos, he would knock us all out with great bass solos. And he knew how to he knew how to play with his thumb, and he knew how to play thin too. I mean, this guy was truly amazing, just amazing. He had so many good relationships with musicians. Whoever was jealous of him still knew how great he was, but he could play with anybody. And I'm very disjointed here. I'm going back to the fact that besides driving up to places like Crowder's Mountain, there's a big area in Charlotte now that's all been developed, but we spent a great deal of time driving in these farm areas, these rural areas outside of Charlotte, exploring and going to places like ravines and X roads and and wherever there was a waterfall and anything that we could find, because that we had a wonderful connection with outdoors as well as everything else. Can you think of anything I might have left out?
George could sell anything.
I watched him in front of people. This goes to selling Rick, the guy that's making this. Hi, Rick. And I know that he talked him into being able to do the music for the movies. And I mean, just the idea that suddenly he's got this gigantic, expensive movie-ola sitting in his apartment, like within a couple of days. I mean, these guys would do anything George said. It wasn't. I'm not just talking about Rick. I'm talking about in general. I needed an electric piano for a job that I didn't have any money to rent. He talked the music store into letting us use it for publicity. And this is a guy that's only, at the time, maybe between 18 and 20, walking around with his ironed hair and funny little quirks, and being able to just convince people of anything. And they all wanted to be around him. They all liked him. He had an aura around him. That was the same with his concert and with his ability to get people together and his ability to make the music. He loved Stevie Wonder. You can hear it a lot in some of the recordings. You may not think you can, but you can. He liked all the great guitar players of that period that were coming along, like John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola and people like that, but he didn't love them. He just knew how to play them. He could do their styles. If you wanted him to do their styles, he could almost do their styles on demand. And John got to the point to where he could play all the jazz drummers as well as the regular popular drummers. They both had such a wide array of talent when it came to their abilities to cop styles, musical styles. I'm running out of stuff here.
Putting the band together to play at Fampas, and Marvin pulled the plug.
I think we mentioned that earlier, but that was another aspect of George. George was not a big guy, but he never backed down from anybody. And he didn't fight with people. I never saw him beat up anybody, but he certainly talked like he was willing to beat somebody up if he didn't like them. And he always knew when somebody was trying to pull something on him. He was very capable of seeing through people when it came to that. One of the things that, like I said, one of the things that bothered me about George is that he started interfering with my relationships with people. And he had a tendency to kind of want to plot out who would be my friends and who wouldn't be my friends and why. And sorry, Barbara, that kind of started bothering me after a while. I think that everybody knew my relationship with George. It wasn't a secret. We had wonderful, wonderful times together, truly brilliant moments of happiness, and we had rotten times together. That's the way it works in a relationship, isn't it? It was a great time in Charlotte for musicians, and watching all of these jazz players grow up and get better and better, and George he just wasn't a fall in line kind of a guy. He was different. He could do all the stuff that all those guys could do, and then he would give you a total variation on everything and do it enough to where you really wanted to listen to it. I'm pretty sure I think I've covered as much as I can cover.
I think you got it.
Okay.